Hello, my name is Brittany Worthen, and I am representing the University of Kentucky. I am sharing with you today my collective case study on teacher decision making in guided reading. The purpose of this study was to better understand how teachers make various instructional decisions in advance of instruction, but also in the moment of instruction. This study also examined how teachers responded to students by adjusting their guided reading instructional plans to better meet the needs of each of their students. Several questions were considered for this study that included: how did teachers make decisions about guided reading instruction? How did teachers make decisions about grouping, planning, and assessing? And how do teachers make in the moment decisions about feedback and support for students, and also adjusting plans to better meet students' needs? The theoretical framework involved how guided reading is grounded within sociocultural theory. This refers to learning that is socially mediated and occurs through an individual's interactions with their community and within cultural frames of reference. This also talks about the development that happens within children as they socially interact with more knowledgeable adults. And works from Vygotsky and Rogoff reflect that notion that students are able to, and children are able to grow in their learning when they interact socially with more knowledgeable peers and adults. This also brings into light the zone of proximal development, a phrase coined by Vygotsky, in the sense that within guided reading, it provides an instructional framework for students where the teacher can guide and support the student on their reading level to the levels in which they need to grow and learn to meet specific grade level standards or grade level expectations. Also within the theoretical framework, Rogoff believed that as an adult assumes responsibility for breaking down tasks or challenges the student, that they can help the student be able to meet specific goals that may appear too difficult for them to do on their own. And this brings into light the idea of scaffolding. Scaffolding occurs when a more knowledgeable learner assumes responsibility for completing tasks necessary that fall out of the parameters and capabilities of less knowledgeable peers. Research previously conducted by Wood, Bruner, and Ross share a lot about what scaffolding is and how a more knowledgeable peer or adult can help a student or a child be able to reach instructional goals by providing that scaffold support. Rogoff also talks about how adults take on this supportive role and are able to provide that scaffold support and break down specific tasks so that students are um, able to do what they are supposed to. They're able to meet their goals. Also, with the theoretical framework, I talk about how guided reading is also situated within this social constructivist theory. And this basically talks about how children individually construct new learning based on existing knowledge that they have. And this brings in works of Dewey and also Vygotsky, and that they both discuss how students are able to learn new knowledge. They're able to grow in their learning based on prior knowledge that they bring to the table. Under the social constructivist theory, I talk about the idea of adaptive teaching, but which is also positioned within social constructivism. And um, a definition for adaptive teaching is that it is a teacher action that is a response to an unanticipated student contribution, a diversion from the lesson plan, or a public statement of change. So this is when a teacher would make a change in his or her lesson plan based on an unexpected student response or student contribution to the lesson that was being taught. Before adaptive teaching can occur, so before teachers can make adjustments to their lesson plans, they must first professionally notice students. And this just means that they must be aware of and observant of their students and how they respond to instruction. Once this happens, teachers are able to be responsive during instruction and respond to specific instructional needs that they have observed. The methods for this study included included the participants, which were three second grade teachers that specifically taught guided reading as a part of their literacy instruction. It also included the students that the teachers taught, although I did not specifically study the students. It was involved, the students were involved because they were in the classroom, and that's who the teachers were obviously teaching. The setting of this research took place in a public elementary school located in central Kentucky. And the three second grade teachers that were chosen for this study were chosen based on the principal's recommendation. It is not something that I did not go into the school and ask for specific teachers. I am a pre-service teacher educator, so I do have a relationship with the elementary schools that are located in a nearby district. So it was really important that I went into this research with an idea of how I would be able to mitigate any bias going into being able to collect data. Therefore, I made sure that the principal would pick teachers who taught guided reading, but also ones that I did not have a personal or professional working relationship with. The data sources for this study included observations, which were which were recorded. So I would go into the classroom, I would set up the video camera, and then I would leave the room and go somewhere else in the school while the observation was being conducted. So I would record by video and then watch the video later. So over an 8-week period, I was able to collect a minimum of four observations every other week. So within the three teachers, I had four instructional observations for a total of 48 different guided reading groups, because each participating teacher would teach four guided reading groups on one instructional day for a total of 48 groups. However, I was only able to analyze 47 guided reading groups because in one of the sessions, a student that did not have parent consent was captured in the video frame, which I therefore had to delete. Each group lasted about 20 minutes for a total of 80 minutes per observational time. So for one instructional day where I was able to go and observe one teacher or have the video camera record the observation, it was for a total of about 80 minutes. I also conducted in-person interviews. So within 1 week of the observation, I would go back to the school and interview the teacher in person. And as another form of data that I collected was through lesson plans. I would collect the day that I observed the teachers, I would collect each of their 4 lesson plans for their guided reading group for that instructional day. For the data analysis of this research, I was able to hand code all of the data. I watched the observations myself and transcribed everything that I saw in the videos, which then helped me to create interview questions later. Codes were created for this research based on teachers' in advanced and in the moment decisions. I first created a first cycle coding method, and I used initial codes that I found from and research based on a previous study by Elliott, where she also conducted research on teacher decision making with small group instruction. So this was very helpful as I first started looking at my data. Then through open coding, I was then able to add and revise an initial list of codes that I looked at. I had a chart paper and just took all of my data and was making all these different themes and codes and writing all these things that was, that I felt was coming out of my data, which was a lot. So in order to narrow that down, I did a second level of coding, which was axial coding, where I refined previous codes that I had been working with from the beginning of my research. Findings for in advance decisions included that teachers used formal and informal assessment data to group students for guided reading and to make some instructional plans, not all, but some. So teachers were able to use formal observations where they had specific framework assessments that they would use that would help them to determine, their reading level and the type of instruction that they would need. And then they also used different countywide assessments that they could help determine what groups they needed to be in. Another finding for in advance decisions was that teachers utilized a program influenced structural framework to make decisions about planning for guided reading. So, the teachers in this study used a specific framework of guided reading called Jan Richardson. And this framework has very specific instructional components and has lesson plan templates that the teacher can use to plan and create for the students. So, a lot of the decisions that were made from each of the teachers were based on the template and the way that the framework was set up. Teachers also made in advance decisions by making instructional connections between whole group instruction, so what they were teaching earlier or in a previous whole group setting, to the guided reading lesson. And then they also made connections between the what they were teaching in guided reading to students' interests. They considered what students liked, the types of genres and types of texts that they were reading outside of guided reading group, and made those considerations as they were planning for guided reading. It was evident throughout the interviews when I was talking to several of the teachers about their plans for making their lesson plans for their guided reading groups. I was aware of and found out that several of the teachers used old lesson plans, recycled lesson plans. So they used lesson plans that they had created for previous students in previous school years. And through all of the data that I found from the in advance decision making process, it was evident that although teachers made several decisions in advance of their guided reading instruction, these decisions were not always grounded in students' instructional needs. It seemed as though they allowed the framework to help make their decisions. They used old lesson plans. They used, what they thought students may like, but other books they were reading, interests that they had, more so than they were focusing on strategies or skills that the students really needed when they sat down to plan their guided reading lessons. Findings for in the moment decisions included that teachers were responsive. So, teachers responded to students by scaffolding instruction. This was seen through teachers prompting students, where they would encourage the students to engage more in the text or go deeper with responses that they were discussing. Teachers confirmed students' reading and writing behaviors. This was seen through teachers giving affirmations of praise, validation, so validating student responses, or reinforcing what students would respond with so that they could use that as a teachable moment for all students, for the good of all students. So that was something that was very evident in the data as they made in the moment decisions that reflected how teachers responded through feedback. Another finding for in the moment decisions was that teachers made thoughtful decisions about instruction. So, as they were responding to students' needs, they just didn't do it randomly. They actually really thought about what their students knew, what they did not know, and how they could best meet their needs. And finally, teachers felt time restrictions. So, a lot of times, and like I said earlier, the guided reading framework from Jan Richardson suggests 20 minutes per guided reading group. So there were a lot of times where teachers had to make in the moment decisions based on them running out of time, or they might have skipped components of the lesson and to its entirety just because they were running out of time. But overall, findings for in the moment decisions showed that teachers were responsive to students' instructional needs. Limitations in this study involve several different things. One is that this study cannot make a generalization about all teachers teaching guided reading, since it was only limited to 3 second grade teachers. So we cannot make those generalizations that this would be the same for all elementary school teachers teaching guided reading, or all second grade teachers in particular. Also, a limitation is that this study only included a guided reading framework that was from Jan Richardson. So there are other types of frameworks out there, other types of resources that teachers can use for guided reading. So it cannot be assumed that teachers teaching guided reading teach in the same way or utilize the same instructional framework as the teachers in this study did. Also, a limitation is the time lapse that happened between the observation and the interview. So usually that was about a 1 week time frame. But if I were to consider when I asked when I asked the teachers specific questions during the interview, the time in which they had actually planned that lesson that I was asking them about would have been at least 2 weeks prior to the time I was interviewing them. So a lot of time, that time gap created forgetfulness, and a lot of answers when I would ask them about their lesson plans included responses like I don't know, or I'm not really sure, or I forgot, or they had to pull back their lesson plan to jog their memory about certain decisions that they made and why they made them. Another limitation is that typically a guided reading lesson plan is taught over 3 to 5 instructional days, and I was only able to observe one of those instructional days. So there are many more decisions that teachers made that were responsive to students' needs, or may have been for the purposes of future instruction, making in advance decisions for later, that I may have missed. And teachers appeared nervous on the guided reading or on the video camera, and that could have hindered their decision making as they were teaching guided reading. Another limitation is that um, sometimes the data that I was talking to them about, or the observations that I was referring to in the interviews, were based on recycled lesson plans. They were on old lesson plans, so it made it really hard for the teachers to talk about their in advance decisions when they were old plans. Implications for this study include that teachers are faced with various decisions prior to and during the implementation of instruction. Another implication is that more focus needs to be spent on teachers and how they are making in advance decisions when it comes to thinking about teachers being able to meet their students' instructional needs. Another implication is possibly a refinement of teacher skills. So the teachers within this study all had at least a decade or more of teaching experience, and it may be more difficult for inexperienced or fairly new teachers to make responsive in the moment decisions if they do not have a lot of that pedagogical or just teaching experience in general. So refinement of those skills and possibly more professional development and attention to those types of decisions would be helpful. Recommendations for future research include further researching how teachers utilize other guided reading instructional frameworks. So there are other resources out there besides the Jan Richardson framework, so it would be interesting to further research that. Also, further researching just teachers' perspectives and their thought processes on how they make the decisions that they do and why those decisions are important. And then a final recommendation for future research is just to gather students' perspectives. So, are the decisions that teachers making during instruction, are those beneficial to students? Is it impacting their learning? In conclusion, we can see now that teachers are faced with an unlimited amount of decisions on a daily basis, not only as they're teaching, but prior to instruction as well. Teachers face challenges as they consider student observations, as they professionally notice students, and then try their best to respond to students meeting their instructional needs. And another conclusion is just to consider the decision process that occurs when planning for and implementing guided reading instruction. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, and so just being able to consider the different processes that go into planning for guided reading and teaching guided reading is really important to consider for educators, administration, stakeholders, etc. And then just considering ways to best support teachers. So, how can teachers make decisions that are in response to students' needs as they plan for guided reading groups, as they plan for instruction, in ways that are meeting every student and all of their needs that exist within the classroom? Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed listening to and learning more about teacher decision making and guided reading. Have a wonderful day.